So today I'm going to explain what we're going to do during week 5 and talk a little bit about the page for week 5 that I created during the last 2 days. Then we're going to spend most of today's class talking about Mario Puzo's The Godfather, the first chapter, which is also most of which you will find in the initial sequence of the Godfather movie, which will be the movie 2 weeks from now. As you can see, I put 4 topics for week 5, The Godfather, and then I added from frick to slick, because what we're going to do is not talk a lot about a single specific film. Rather, I'll offer you 3 different profiles of crimes in the post-war cinema, indicative of ways to represent criminals that are quite different from what we've seen and, more importantly, what we'll see in the Godfather trilogy. 1953 is the year of a wonderful little noir film directed by Ida Lupino, The Hitchhiker, where you have this freakish criminal, a deviant, somebody who's physically different and psychologically, morally different from regular people. 1960 will be the central film of this group of 3, a famous film with Frank Sinatra and a few of his friends and colleagues called Ocean's 11, and you might be familiar with the remake. In this case, I would say the remake is in many ways better than the original. And I will also propose some ideas and scenes from the Thomas Crown Affair 1968. There too, you have a remake from 1999, but the 1968 film is in fact better. And both in Ocean's 11 and the Thomas Crown Affair, you find this very slick kind of criminal who's elegant, refined, bon vivant, a viveur, somebody who enjoys life, somebody who's trying to get integrated into society by taking the shortcut of a big heist that would allow this character to be more in control, to gain freedom from certain social constrictions. As you remember, I recommended that if you haven't done so already, that you post your first written assignment by the end of this week, which you do by going to the Google Docs file that I shared with you at the beginning of the semester. And if you don't have the link available, just email me and I'll send you back that link. The way the assignments work is the following. You have 4 possible topics. You have to write 4 of these assignments. It's up to you to decide what films or texts to base your examples on. As you may see, the keywords in the 4 topics have to do with the schema of Machiavellian ideology that you find inside week 2, and I'll show it to you today as well. However, although I recommend that you apply the filter of Machiavellian ideas to the reading and interpretation of whatever films or texts you include in your assignment, keep in mind that each of the examples that you will find might have other components or might have themes that are contrary to the Machiavellian schema. So try not to be too rigid. And keep in mind, the most important thing is that your assignment has to be developed from the bottom up. The bottom being the actual characters, situations, scenes, or even the actual language, the lines in those films. That's how you build the discussion of these generic themes to make them specific to the range of examples, to the film or films that you have picked for this particular assignment. Okay? I posted talking points to show how this would be done. I haven't included it in this presentation under Little Caesar. So if you go to week 3, that's where you'll find them. Was it week 3 or week 2? Well, you'll have the films listed in the lectures and readings page, so you'll be able to navigate there. And of course, as I suggested in the past, if you're not completely sure, especially for the first assignment, once you've completed a draft, put a comment asking me to review it, or otherwise, if you feel confident that you've done your best, when you're done with your assignment, you can put a comment saying, this assignment is complete, please review it. And I know that a few people have completed their assignment. I'm a little behind in the correction of those because during the weekend already, I was feeling worse, in fact, than I feel today. So I didn't do that kind of work that was on my list. Okay? So, in the first chapter of book 1 of the Godfather's novel, which is one of the longest in book 1, Mario Puzo did a great job at introducing the basic elements of the premise, of the situation, before the development of the story. And what you will notice is that rather than introducing the main character, which is Vito Corleone, directly to the readers, Mario Puzo gave us an idea of the complexity of the character of Vito Corleone and his situation by showing us how different characters either interact with the Don or see how they see the Don. So, for example, among the many primary and secondary characters in this chapter, you see clearly 3 characters that are exemplary of the community that exists around the inner circle of Vito Corleone's family and the first outer circle of his crime family. So 3 exemplary characters who will come to the wedding of Vito Corleone's daughter Connie to ask him for a favor. And we'll analyze them with reference to their situation, what they are trying to ask, what price they'll have to pay in order to obtain what they're asking, and then the means deployed by Don Vito in order to achieve the outcome that these characters are looking for. The next group is the 3 sons of Vito Corleone, Sonny, Fredo, and Michael. And the next group is the outsider. At least I used that label, even though one of them is not really an outsider. That would be Luca Brasi, the murderer, the man who helps Vito in certain situations. But interestingly, as we will see, he is being presented as a kind of outsider, somebody who stands out, somebody who, even among the people who participate in the marriage, is kept at a distance. So not entirely placed into the situation like many of the other characters. The other outsiders, of course, are Kay Adams, Michael's girlfriend, and in part the FBI, but more importantly, the other partial outsider is Tom Hagen. the stepbrother to Sonny and Michael, but somebody again whose position in the family is a bit more peculiar, not as simple a character as a stepson. So let's look at the three exemplary characters who come asking for a favor, and you know that the theme of the favor occupies a big position, a big part of chapter 1 in many ways. The first one in my list, because it is the first one you find on page 1 of the novel, is Amerigo Bonasera, who's an undertaker. And again, let's look, using the same matrix for all the characters, let's look at his issue. And even before he goes to see Don Vito, the novel will present this character by himself within the situation that will prompt his visit to Don Vito Corleone. The issue is, and I've tried to summarize this so that we can proceed quickly, is that he has a daughter that I labeled as Americanized because we know about her that she grew up not as a typical Italian daughter or the daughter to an Italian-American family, but she was allowed to embrace the American lifestyle, for example, live as a more independent woman. This, in turn, led to a situation where she went out for drinks with a group of 3 men. They harassed her, tried to have sex with her. She resisted, she was beaten up by them. So from the point of view of the character, the issue really is lack of control over the outcome, because in the first few pages we see Amerigo at the trial where the men who beat up his daughter cruelly are sentenced to a suspended sentence of 3 years. And therefore they walk out of the tribunal as free men. So Amerigo, trying to play the part of the model immigrant who wants to be fully assimilated, wants to abide by the laws and the rules of American society that gave him economic prosperity, finds himself not having sufficient control over the outcome of the situation because these criminals are not doing any time in jail. Clearly, besides the ethnic elements which are heavily represented in these 3 exemplary characters who will go and ask a favor, there is also a moralistic take on their situation. In this case, the moralistic view of the character comes with the idea that his problem, his shortcoming, was also the lack of control over his own family. Right? He embraced a different kind of model and now is paying the price because he tried to be an American father, right, rather than an Italian father. That is to say, giving up control over his own daughter. Right? He represents the idea of justice for the common man, but possibly with hints at discrimination based not simply on the ethnic background of Amerigo, but rather his social standing. That is to say, it is implicit in the narrative that the judge gives these criminals this kind of mild sentence because they come from fine families. The word is from the novel, right? Meaning that Amerigo is not socially connected, has no leverage or influence over this decision, whereas the families or the community of these criminals intervened to get them a pardon, essentially, a nullified sentence. What will Amerigo ask Don Vito at the wedding of Don Vito's daughter, Connie. Justice for his daughter, clearly, that is to say, some kind of punishment for the criminals who beat up his daughter, but there is also a personal component. He wants revenge for himself. He felt powerless, and he wants to borrow Don Vito's power. And you see that there is something wrong in here, right? He wants to use Don Vito rather than ask for a favor. He's not going there with the right attitude. And this will be remarked in several ways by the Don. What is the price that will be imposed on the satisfaction, the fulfillment of this favor? He will have to show more respect for the Don, right? The Don will tell him that he cannot just go and demand justice or treat the Don as his own instrument to impose justice. The Don will tell him also that he needs to get his priorities straight in terms of the social hierarchy, right? Which in the film is rendered with beautiful lines, but the same concept can be found in the novel as well. That is to say, his mistake, Amerigo's mistake from the point of view of Don Vito, is that he first went to the police and to the justice system, and only when the justice system failed him, he went to Don Vito. So Don Vito was not higher than the American justice system in his social hierarchy. So he has to change that. And how can he change that? By being readmitted into the Don's clan. The theme of membership in the clan, belonging to a clan, is very strong in chapter 1 of the novel. I'm saying readmitted because the Don and Bonacera knew each other. Don's wife was the godmother to Amerigo's daughter, and yet Don Vito will tell him that he's never seen him, right? That he never came to pay his respect, to pay homage to Don Vito. The idea of the clan is exactly connected to the theme of the hierarchy of power that I mentioned earlier. That is to say, in southern Italian culture, and more generally in cultures around the world that inherited traits of feudalism, feudalism being a kind of organization not limited to the Middle Ages, where everything is done through personal relationships and connections. If you're a member of the clan, then the allegiance to the clan, the rules and practices of the clan come before social rules in general, laws, even moral rules applicable to the general community. Okay? Belonging to a clan means that you can help a member of the clan. You're not doing this person a particular favor, you're just honoring the rules of a different niche, a different subset of the general community. So you have to follow the rules of the clan first and then those of society. And the price that is not exacted at the moment of the ask is that in the future, at a time that might not come, says Vito, but in fact will come soon, he must return a favor to Don Vito Corleone when asked. The means deployed by Don Vito Corleone in order to satisfy, to fulfill this request by Amerigo are, of course, indicative of various components in the profile of Don Vito and his position as head of this mafia family. In this case, he will resort to force, and you will see how there are different nuances through the asks of different characters in the first part of the novel. In this case, it'll be sheer violence. That is to say, members of Clemenza's group will be sent over to beat up into a pulp the guys who did this to Amerigo's daughter. Interesting though, because this in some ways is a well-organized novel, even though force is the primary component of the execution of the plan in order to fulfill the request, there is a hint in the pages that describe this beating. There is a hint that even force by itself, when you're willing and free to use it, is never enough. Why? Because in the context of narrating how these men go, it's Polly and someone else, go and beat up these guys, Mario Puzo will explain how a mafia organization works, the different levels, and how information is transmitted, communicated from one level to another in such a way that whoever will execute the evil deed is several layers removed from the people who ordered it, don't know why this was ordered, don't know the circumstances, and would be of very limited help in case they were arrested and wanted to collaborate with justice. That is to say, while force is being used by a very powerful Don, who is Vito Corleone, in order to beat up guys and make a favor to someone like Amerigo Bonasera, the narrator is telling you in a very Machiavellian, mature way that even the ordering of this beating represents a delegation of, an act of delegating power to others. That is to say, the very knowledge, the information, whatever information relates to this action, empowers the people in the organization. And therefore, it becomes necessary for Don Vito to go through a series of levels with one person only at each level reporting to the lower levels only what is needed for that person to act. This represents how there are consequences to the deployment of force even when that force is unobstructed, even when there is no one to impede you from using that force. The moment you order the use of force, in that moment your power is somewhat fragmented and you're exposed to some consequences because the knowledge that you ordered that crime can be used against you. And so it's necessary to go through a procedure whereby he tells a capo, the capo tells others in the organization, etc. The next exemplary character connected to a request to the Don is Johnny Fontaine, a character clearly based on HUI, which famous singer-actor from the post-war era. The novel begins in 1945, right? Who would be the Italian-American singer-actor whose profile inspired Mario Puzo to a degree. Frank Sinatra, right? Johnny Fontaine is not Frank Sinatra, but there are many elements in his story that are clearly Sinatresque, okay? What is the issue for Johnny Fontaine? A failing career due to a weak voice, something that Frank Sinatra suffered from by the end of the 1930s and through the 1940s. And the other problem is that he was blacklisted by a powerful Hollywood producer by the name of Waltz because he disrespected Waltz by having sex with a young actress that Waltz wanted for himself. The other issue at a more personal, private level is that his going through the failure of his second marriage. So he separated from his first wife, who was an Italian-American wife, got married to an American actress by the name of Margot, but he's not able to, similarly to Amerigo, who was not able to, or not even willing to control his daughter and tell his daughter, no, you're my daughter in an Italian-American family, you cannot go out by yourself without a chaperone, with men that are not known by the family, related to you in any official way. In the same way, Johnny Fontaine is not able to control this beautiful and actress with a strong personality. What he's asking from the Godfather, first of all, personal support, psychological support, reassurance, comfort, because he's part of the family. The Godfather is like a father to him. And then help with his career. He thinks that there is a film where he would be perfect for the part of the protagonist. The film is about to be shot in a week or so, and is asking to be given the part of the protagonist in spite of the circumstances. What is the price that he will have to pay to Don Vito Corleone? Proximity to the Don, which is always important, if you notice, for every one of these exemplary characters, but particularly for Johnny Fontaine. That is to say, to be at the wedding and to sing there, because this clearly will enhance the quality of the influence of Don Vito, because all the people invited there will see that Don Vito is connected to this famous actor, a celebrity almost, and that this celebrity, this star of music and cinema, has agreed to come and sing a couple of songs, which is in fact the most this character can sing without suffering from the physical consequences of the strain on his voice. The other prize is in turn psychological. In exchange for support, he has to be instructed, lectured by the Don about the shortcomings of the limitation of his masculinity. The Don will invite him to behave like a man, not to cry, not to be so emotional, to show confidence, and to use strength, force, and control in his marriage. In a small lecture given by Don Vito to Johnny Fontaine, you understand a Machiavellian principle that even within a relationship, love cannot be enough to gain control over the relationship, over the couple. So he's being told by Don Vito that his marriages failed because he didn't want to control his women and, if necessary, punish them physically, with specific reference to the actress, the American actress Margot. And in fact, you see one of those more vulgar and in many ways excessive scenes that you find in The Godfather, which would have needed a good trimming, a good editing, where Johnny is trying to inflict physical punishment on Margot, but since she's about to star in a film, he cannot really beat her up, because otherwise he would show on camera. And in the end, she makes fun of him for not being a man. She tells him, in other words, what Don Vito will tell him, that he's not enough of a man. What will be the means applied by Don Vito to satisfy this request? Initially, just the use of influence. He will send Tom Hagen, his lawyer and counselor, consigliere, to make the organization's influence available to the producer, Waltz. They know that the producer is facing union troubles, and that one of his actors in his production house is suffering from a problem with drug addiction, and they promise to intervene and adjust those issues. When the use of influence fails, because Waltz despises the mafia in general and also feels comforted by his own powerful connections. Multiple times in chapter 1, they tell us that he knows Hoover, the head of the FBI. When the use of influence fails, there is a gradual escalation. They don't go from influence to force. They move up to deterrence. That is to say, a calculated use of force whereby they don't do anything physically to Waltz. They simply killed his horse in a famous scene from the film. The head of the horse is found by Waltz in his own bed, and Waltz can simply guess the rest. That is to say, if they were able to complete this operation in a compound that was guarded without no one noticing them, if they were able to get to his bedroom, then there is no limit to what they can do to him. And a week later, Johnny Fontaine will work in this film. So notice again the various sides of the use of force and power. In the case of the first character, Amerigo, is sheer force. In this case, influence and deterrence. The difference between influence and deterrence is that influence is based just on persuasions, right? You just use words. Deterrence is based either on a threat or on the visible display of force that will prompt the character, the person who is on the other end of this display, to rethink their position. Finally, of these three exemplary characters, although there is another character, Antonio, the pizzeria owner, who will ask for a loan, but he receives less space. But the other conspicuous character related to the theme of the requests on the wedding's day is Nazarene, the baker. The issue in this case is that there is an Italian prisoner of war. As I said, we're in 1945. There are Italian soldiers interned in various areas of the United States. But because the war is over, and actually for some of them after the armistice of 1943, they're allowed to leave their camp during the day, work outside, and they have to go back to their internment prison camp at the end of the day. This particular prisoner, Enzo, is working in the bakery owned and operated, managed by Nazarene. He's fallen in love with his daughter, and the problem is that these prisoners are being repatriated as soon as possible. A group after the other, they're being sent home. At the end of the war, prisoners were not sent home immediately. For example, my uncle Silvano came home at the end of 1946 from an internment camp in South Africa. But even he, after 1943, was allowed to leave the camp during the day and go work in a farm, and therefore have this job. When it came to returning, keep in mind at the end of the war, there were also large numbers of soldiers that needed to be repatriated, and they were the priority, not the prisoners. The ask for the baker is to make Enzo an American citizen so that he can stay and get married to his daughter. The price, in this case there will be a monetary price to pay. $2,000 is the bribe for someone to process the citizenship request. And the other indirect, immaterial prices are loyalty to the Don, respect, and this time Nazarene is the opposite of Amerigo. Nazarene is a model member of the outer community of Don Vito's family. Clearly, we see that in his case, the clan is his priority. So he's first and foremost a member of that social clan, and then an American citizen. And clearly is willing to return favors. In fact, is showing his respect in various ways. For example, by sending pastries and cakes for Easter, Christmas, on other occasions during the year, without being asked by the Don, just to show his respect. The means deployed by the Don in order to satisfy this request are the use of political influence. So influence and just influence at the political level. The family is connected to a number of politicians, and astutely, shrewdly, the Don will tell Don not to give this service to perform to an Italian-American senator, because that would be too conspicuous, might harm the image of that politician, but to employ instead a Jewish senator they have in their pocket. Next trio of characters that you find in chapter 1 are the sons. And as you will read in the introduction by Francis Ford Coppola for the 50th anniversary edition of the novel in 2019, Francis Ford Coppola, the director of The Godfather, has this great intuition. These are like the sons of a king, the three sons of a king, and each one of them reflects a different quality of their father. We have Sonny, the oldest brother. What is his nature? And here too we find elements of Machiavellianism, or the Machiavellian view of humanity. He is too eager to use force. Very impulsive guy. And he cannot be a proper leader because he's often reactive, and control instead is emphasized through the character of Michael and then Vito as a staple of leadership. He's non-compliant, but in a bad way. Then we'll see how Michael is non-compliant in a more positive way, indicative of his own leadership. Non-compliant because he's clearly hard to instruct. He doesn't follow his father's ways. His father would like him to hang around so that he can learn how to become a leader. But then when he is called into the office of Don Vito, he will be at the window looking outside, because his interest during this day is just women, having sex with other women, and he will have sex with Lucy, and that's a part I cut from the excerpts. Unnecessary, should have been cut from the original novel as well. A bad sex scene. You can check yourself. His lack of self-control, which is another side of his excessive reactivity, is apparent throughout his life in various ways, including his sexual activities, right? He's not able to control his sexual desires, even when there might be consequences affecting the reputation of the family or his own family. The middle brother is Fredo. His nature is completely different from Sonny, is too eager to comply, if anything, but don't take this to mean that he's a good guy, because his eagerness to comply happens within the culture of the family, which is best described by referring to a book by sociologist Banfield, from the 1950s, where he talked in reference to southern Italy about amoral feminism. The idea that for your own family, you bend the rules or you go outside the rules, and you don't feel any remorse. You don't feel that you've done anything immoral. He's very agreeable, also very affectionate, because he has to represent the attachment to the family, which is a big theme in the novel and a big part of the profile of Don Vito's character. Next, we have the youngest son, Michael. What is his nature? Independent and intentional. In fact, he's sitting at a different table, and you see that very well in the film. Intentional, meaning that he is in charge of every action. He doesn't just get along. And those are clear signs of leadership. He's only partially agreeable, again, he'll decide when to go by his father's commands or recommendations. And clearly, the opposite of an impulsive guy is more of a thinker and then a planner. That is to say, his main qualities are strong reason and determination. That is to say, when he decides to do something, then he has the drive and motivation to pursue that to the end. Whereas Sonny is clearly somebody who can be distracted. Even a young woman passing by would be enough to distract Sonny from his own duties. The outsiders. As I said, I placed in this group Luca Brasi and Tom Hagen, who might not seem as outsiders, but just to emphasize that they're not fully represented as insiders to the family or to the crime family. Why Luca Brasi can be seen as an outsider? First of all, even in the film you see him isolated, the same way that Michael is isolated. In the book, it is remarked directly and indirectly that he should not be there. In fact, Luca Brasi himself is surprised at receiving an invitation to the wedding, because he knows that as a callous murderer, he should not be seen close to the Don, because this connection has to be hidden, because nobody should be able to connect the murders committed by Luca Brasi to the boss who ordered those murders, right? Because this might tarnish the Don's image. And something like that happened in a joking way with Kay. Kay Adams will ask about Luca, who looks like an animal. And Michael jokingly will say, well, he does things for my father, but then he goes straight to the truth, telling her as an anecdote, possibly unconfirmed, that he killed 6 men during a so-called olive oil war to further the interests of Don Vito. Clearly, what makes him an outsider also is the fact that he's difficult to control. This is the only man that the Don himself is afraid of, right? And this is more clear in the novel than in the film. A novel gives more room to an author to include more nuances, to add more nuances to a character. And clearly, we know about the association between violence and fear in Machiavelli as well. He represents pure force, unadulterated force. He's all force. There is no influence to Luca Brasi. He was made by nature to fulfill that role, and clearly his brain is limited, and therefore this makes him dangerous, more difficult to control, but also exploitable, right? He has picked Don Corleone, decided to be loyal to him, and so he can be controlled to a degree, but even the Don knows that it's not fully controllable. Kay Adams clearly is an outsider here, the girlfriend of Michael. She does not belong to that social group. And the novel, again, goes to further extent to clarify that. Talking about her, the fact that people find her to be too thin, too intelligent for a woman, too much of a free thinker. And clearly, she is very curious about the characters, about the people at this wedding, but she maintains a distance from them. So they keep her at a distance, but she is also quite attached. And therefore, you can see how Michael will have problems dealing with her whenever he would like to control her, and eventually he will fail. She represents commitment, that is to say, the only way to deal with her would be through a fair and equal commitment, where she's not simply becoming a wife to be controlled by a husband because she's her wife. Other outsiders in chapter 1 are the FBI agents who come to take the license plates of the cars that are there, they represent the use of power to obtain indirect control. They're not arresting anyone. They're not using their handguns. They're using knowledge, gathering knowledge in order to build up their power over this family, and they represent the authority, right? You can put down, and it seems in chapter 1 that Sonny would like to punch one of these guys, but you cannot easily put down the whole organization. So they come with the support of this authority. Tom Hagen, the story of Tom is that he had Irish parents, both with psychological and physical issues, abuse, addiction, stories of addictions. He was an orphan as a young teenager, living in the streets, suffering at some point from an eye infection. Sonny, who has a big heart, is impulsive but also open, not as guarded as Michael, found him in the streets, took him home one night, and Tom Hagen never left. However, he was not adopted as a stepson. He was treated with great care and affection, and the novel has a nice line saying that he was treated better than the sons, than Fredo, Michael, and Sonny, because they had to be treated in a tough way so that they could grow up and become leaders, toughen their skins. Whereas Tom was treated with more respect, a different kind of gentleness. He was allowed to study. He picked law because he, staying in that environment, absorbed the idea that a lawyer is powerful in ways that are different from the violent strategies used by the family, became the temporary consigliere, the temporary counselor to Vito Corleone before the beginning of this novel, because the real consigliere, Genco Abandando, is sick in the hospital, and Don Vito will go and visit him before he dies. Clearly, even though he was accepted into inner circle of the clan, there are limitations to his level of assimilation, and there are remarks to that effect in the novel. He's partially agreeable, that is to say, we know that he's complying with Don Vito's orders because he doesn't have any other option or any better option. And he represents influence, right? He's not directly a violent man, but there is more than influence to his character. There is deterrence, because he's able to, for example, plan the killing of the horse of Hollywood producer Waltz, the placing of the head of the horse in his bed. All of this is the result of his planning, right? So it's not just a lawyer staying completely away from violence. It's very much involved with strategy, and he represents strategy and planning as a theme. So let's go and see a few passages from the novel. As I said, this is the edition I used for your excerpts, is the edition that came out in 2019, 50 years after the first novel. A few things about Mario Puzo. He was born in 1920, fought in World War II. After the war, he was trying to make a living as a writer. He published short stories. He worked as an editor. He published a novel, The Fortunate Pilgrim, that we will read some pages from, inspired by his own family. He lost his father, his mother, was left with 7 kids. But until he published The Godfather, Mario Puzo was not really a successful writer. He was full of debts. He was not able to support his own lifestyle, and he was a terrible individual, a gambler, a drinker. But then he struck gold when he got the idea of writing this novel about the mafia, even though by his own admission, he didn't know directly any mafia member. But he thought he had an understanding, and this, and the way that this novel becomes realistic, and a lot of members of the mafia have vouched for the realism, for the plausibility of the situations and the characters, is that he inserted into the novel these Machiavellian elements that can be found in any organization, political or non-political, pursuing power and trying to maintain power. So, wrote this novel, and immediately it was clear that a lot of publishers were interested in the novel. It was published in 1969, sold millions of copies right away, and clearly the book was bought to make a film that came out in 1972. During the 1970s, he went to Hollywood to work not only on the Godfather's script, but also on other films, for example, Superman. And then he continued on writing other books about the mafia, books about politics, about the Borgias, etc. He died in 1999. He had a house in Bayshore, South Bayshore, right? So one nice thing about this edition is that you find a short introduction by the director, Francis Ford Coppola, and this is a nice story, and also a good intro to anyone who hasn't read the novel, because Coppola says, when they gave me the book with the idea that I should make a film out of it, I saw an Italian name, and immediately I thought about Italian intellectuals such as Italo Calvino, one of the greatest Italian writers of the 20th century, or Umberto Eco, who was a professor and a writer. And instead I read it, and it's funny, he calls it a potboiler, but that's the reality of the book. Potboiler, meaning something you write to make ends meet, to put food on the table, not because you have a strong inspiration, right? And it is. It is true also that it is a book filled with sex and silliness. And I would say a lot of silliness about sex and man-woman relationships that should have been at least reduced or cut if he had had a good editor. It is true, though, as Coppola says, that within this book there is a great story and a great narrative, almost classical in its nature. And directors have this way to go to the core of a story to be made into a film. And that's his great intuition. This is like the story of a king, Don Vito, with 3 sons, each of whom had inherited an aspect of his personality. Sonny represents this strong instinct and this impulse to intervene, act, and rectify, change situations that we will see in The Godfather Part 2. Fredo represents the attachment to the family, and Michael represents planning, the strategizing that made Vito powerful. I've already told you, and this comes from Mario Puzo himself, from the preface to a later edition of The Fortunate Pilgrim, the novel inspired by his own family. There, Mario Puzo says, the words of Don Vito and his attitude is modeled after my mother. And what is that they have in common? Wisdom, right? Because in Machiavellian terms, a leader, a strong leader, must have influence, smarts, ruthlessness. There has to be a strong drive and determination to good leadership. Love for her family. This is the other element. And what makes the formula of the Godfather's trilogy of films different from the others. But in Machiavellian terms, love over family would be the necessity of leadership to do things for the greater good of a larger community. Right? And they found a formula. They found a formula that worked. That's why they did 3 films. They could have done more. In Coppola's mind, the story was over when Michael Corleone had traversed the arc of his character. What is the arc of the character seen by the director? That Michael Corleone starts from being alienated, distant from his family, and then becomes like his own father, becomes the Godfather himself. He has to do that in order to protect his family, but he's also a tragic character because he gets the power of his father, but he loses the connection, the sincere, authentic connection to his family. This is the arc of Michael's, and in his view, this should have been enough. You find, interestingly, that Coppola and Puzo didn't always go see things the same way about the film. They were in disagreement to some things. And it's interesting, I highlighted this, because in some ways, Coppola was more Machiavellian than Puzo. For example, Puzo didn't want Michael to kill his brother, which is a very Machiavellian act. Following this in the book, you find a note from Puzo's son that repeats some of the things said by Coppola. He tells you, confirms that when Puzo wrote the novel, he was broke, right? He had people asking for money back every day. And confirms that he did not have any direct knowledge of the Italian-American mafia. And gives you the formula that Coppola was alluding to, which is family values together with crime stories. But not just in the same film, but with a profound connection. The side of the family and the side of crime becomes two sides of the same story, of the same coin. And this idea that family values are typical of Italian culture, and therefore mafia is typical of Italian culture, because if you have strong family values, then you can create crime families and keep them going. Again, I'm not endorsing this statement. I'm just indicating that to your, placing that to your attention because it is an interesting idea, right? So, The Godfather is a story about a family with a great and solid family values, okay? This is the Machiavellian schema that I mentioned earlier, both for your assignments and also as an introduction to the keywords in the novel to identify the themes in the novel.